what we have to understand is what we're looking at is gross movement patterns. So we're not really looking at anatomical function, we're looking at gross movement patterns. So what we want to look at, and we can pull up some data later, but what we want to look at in the golf swing is how well you create momentum and transfer momentum from parts of the body to other parts of the body, and then ultimately create club head speed that way. And there's a distinctive pattern of creating momentum, and then transferring momentum along the chain. And so we look at gross patterns like that, like kinetic link. Or when we look at, for example, lower body mechanics, we're looking more at how well you use a shift in the center of mass, or kind of linear translation, to produce torque or rotation. So there's a distinctive pattern that crops up. When you look at, like, for example, best golfers in the world, they produce certain movements with respect to how they shift weight and rotate their pelvis. So we look at more like superficial, gross movement patterns as opposed to anatomical. Some of the systems get a little bit closer, but most motion analysis systems are going to be pretty limited with respect to stuff like that. A long time ago, we were asked to look at, when you're going through knee flexion extension, look at the translation that the knee's going through. I mean, that's just impossible unless you drill, unless you get a zoom on the leg and you literally, like, because it's so, we're talking, millimeters of movement. You drill literally, like, mount markers into the bone and stuff like that for research purposes, but for clinical, it's not really practical. So we're essentially at gross movement patterns, kinetic link, lower body mechanics. When we look at core coordination or spine stability, we don't look at, again, as anatomical structure. We look at it more in terms of the fact that to produce a good golf swing, for example, the body has to maintain an axis of rotation in space. And from that axis of rotation, it needs to accelerate body parts rotationally, essentially perpendicular to that axis of rotation, maintain a plane for the club to swing on, and has to do that, all that stuff, while maintaining axis in sequence. So we look at how well the body holds an axis of rotation and then sequences rotation around that, or sort of along that chain. So we look at, more activity-specific function as opposed to anatomical-based function. So it's limited that way. You're gonna get gross movements. There's some stuff where, like, we might look at knee flexion extension, hip flexion, elbow flexion extension. Those are pretty simple movements, and those we can do pretty effectively. But some things are way more difficult than others, and spine is as an individual segmented joints is pretty.
Yeah, the reason why I asked was just because there's so many things that connect to the spine that can have an effect from a kinetic chain perspective. When we look at fascia, I mean, there's something going on with someone adductors to the cervical spine that can affect rotation. So discerning what kind of exercises you might do based on your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, there's a blending of what what we look at, and then what you see as a clinician and what you're looking for. So we don't, like, that a lot of that kind of stuff is best left up to hands-on evaluation. Whether it be some sort of functional movement screen or some sort of actual evaluation, hands-on evaluation of a person. What we would be able to tell you is, in the course of creating distal end speed, as you move from the ground up, how much rotational speed is created, let's say, for example, at what we call pelvic or hip segment sections of the body, right? So how much rotational speed is being created, and then how well that's coordinated as you move up the chain. And so where we have breakdowns in that pattern, we can identify certain areas that might be causing breakdowns, and we can guide you, in those areas. A lot of times, function's affected by structural issues. A lot of times it's not. So we're just looking at how well they create distal end speed. Like, you can actually create, like, you can film a 75-year-old guy who's really restricted, very little swing, very little power in his swing. But in terms of connection, athletic, basic, I create momentum, I transfer momentum along the chain. Does a pretty good job of transferring that momentum. You can look at guys who are physically, physical specimens, and have no sense of how to create momentum and transfer momentum. So we're looking more at sort of the, I don't want to say superficial, because that gives it the sense that it's not meaningful, but it's more surface or gross movement pattern, kind of connection. So what would be cool is to say, I know this athlete has certain issues. Well, how do they manifest in terms of swinging a golf ball, or cycling, that kind of stuff. So I mean, like for cycling, what we're looking at is there's a distinctive push-pull on the crank arms that defines an effective movement pattern. So the top cyclists in the world create a certain pattern of pushing and pulling on the crank arm. And it comes from, that pushing and pulling action comes from certain patterns at the knee, the hip, the spine, the rotation, stabilization, that kind of thing. Again, more from the surface perspective. So we just assess how well does a person push and how well do they pull. You know, how much speed are they, or how much force are they applying? Where is it applied? What's the sequence? What's the coordination behind pushing and pulling? And is it efficient? Is it symmetric? And where are their issues? You know, and then we provide that information to the clinician. It's kind of, you know, that's where we jump on and say, okay, this is where we saw left side issue, right side issue here, boom, boom, boom. Take your, you know, hands-on evaluation, your screens, and where do you find, you know, the possibility of limitation impacting that movement.
So basically, your system is kind of like an adjunct to whatever someone is already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely don't replace any hands-on evaluation. You know, we don't really replace functional movement screens. We just provide a level of understanding of how someone's, you know, like I'll use the bike example, but how someone's pushing and pulling against those crank arms. So you can do a thorough hands-on evaluation, the musculoskeletal system. You can do a really thorough functional movement screen and basically understand how they connect a lot of that together to kind of move. But you still don't have a really good understanding of how well do they push and pull against those crank arms. You know, what impacts that. Some of it's just bike setup, you know, seats too high, you know. So I mean, you know, there's things that, and all we look at is, did they do it well? Did they not do it well? How you know, where were their issues? And then, you know, was it seat too high? Was it you know, an issue like you're saying, you know, structurally that was playing a role, technique, you know? And there's interesting things there though. Like with cycling as an example, you can see there's very distinct differences between a more upright posture a road cyclist takes on most, you know, and a time trial tough. There's a distinct difference in how you push-pull against those crank arms, and within that context, there's good and there's bad, you know. So yeah, it's an add-on. It's just an additional tool to use to assess.